They said the Baltic Sea would be calm that night, just wind and light waves. But by morning, the sea had swallowed a ship. It would become the deadliest peacetime European shipwreck since the Titanic. The MS Estonia, once a modern marvel of Nordic engineering, now rests in darkness 80 meters below the surface, along with the memory of 852 souls who never made it home. On September 27, 1994, the Estonia departed from Tallinn, Estonia, bound for Stockholm, Sweden. It was a route the ferry had traveled many times before, ferrying passengers and cars across the Baltic with quiet reliability. The vessel was more than just transportation. It was a cultural bridge, a symbol of post-Soviet connection between East and West. On board were 989 people, passengers from Estonia, Sweden, Finland, and several other nations. Some were business travelers, others tourists, and many were simply returning home. The evening began uneventfully. Passengers played cards, dined, wandered the decks, or settled into their cabins. A musician played a small show. The Estonia, built in 1980 and refurbished with luxurious additions, was a large roll-on, roll-off ferry with a bow visor that opened to allow cars and trucks to drive on and off. It measured 155 meters in length and was considered sturdy enough for Baltic crossings, even in poor weather. But the sea has its own secrets. As the night progressed, winds picked up. Waves reached 4 to 6 meters. Around 1 a.m., passengers reported hearing loud bangs, metal slamming echoing through the lower decks. Some said it felt like the ship was breathing wrong, groaning against the weight of water. Soon after, the vessel suddenly listed heavily to starboard. Objects flew across cabins. People tumbled out of bunks. It was chaos. The official report would later state that the ship's bow visor had failed, allowing seawater to rush into the car deck. With the bow door compromised, the water overwhelmed the ship's internal balance. Within minutes, the Estonia developed a 30 to 45 degree tilt. Most of those inside stood no chance. Hallways became vertical tunnels. Lifeboats were impossible to launch. By 1:50 a.m., the ship was gone, just 35 minutes after it began to sink. Only 137 people survived. As the sun rose over the icy Baltic, debris floated in silence. Rescue helicopters and ships arrived too late for most. Bodies drifted among life rings. Survivors, huddled in life rafts or clinging to wreckage, suffered hypothermia, frostbite, and trauma. Some were pulled from the sea after hours of floating unconscious. Others were never found. The Estonia's resting place lies off the southern coast of Finland, closer to Sweden than to Estonia, beneath a cold sheet of water that now serves as a maritime grave. It's marked on maps, surrounded by legal protections and haunted by questions. How could such a tragedy occur in modern times? In the months that followed, a joint investigation by Estonia, Finland, and Sweden concluded that structural failure of the bow visor was the primary cause. Yet from the very beginning, survivors and families raised concerns about gaps in the story. Why did so few make it out? Why were alarm systems so delayed? And what about the sound of explosions? Reported by some passengers before the sinking, the sea, it seems, is not only deep, it is silent. And silence holds secrets longer than most men can bear. Maritime tragedy often becomes legend. But with the Estonia, the loss was not a legend. It was immediate. It was real. It affected nearly every Estonian family. In Sweden, the mourning was nationwide. Flags flew at half-mast. Television programming halted. Thousands attended candle-lit vigils. And beneath all the public grieving was a quiet rage, a fury born of helplessness. Today, the name Estonia evokes not just the ship, but the wound it left. It is the memory of that strange electric hour when a peaceful ferry crossing became Europe's worst modern maritime disaster. And as we move deeper into the story, through the metal and the storm and the memories, we ask, what really happened to the Estonia? The MS Estonia wasn't always a ship wrapped in tragedy. Before the haunting headlines and morning vigils, it was simply a product of Nordic engineering and a vision for regional connection. Born in the early 1980s under the name Viking Sally, she was launched from the shipyards of Meyer Werft in Papenburg, West Germany, in 1980. Initially operated by Viking Line, she was sleek, swift, and built for efficiency. At 155 meters long, capable of carrying over 1,000 passengers in more than 460 vehicles, she was a workhorse of the Baltic. Over the next decade, the ship would change hands, names, and routes, from Viking Sally to Silja Star, then Wasa King, and finally Estonia in '93. That final transformation came with more than a paint job. Imo, I'm It was symbolic. Estonia had recently regained independence from the Soviet Union. Purchasing and operating its own modern ferry symbolized national confidence. She became the flagship of the state-owned Etched Line company, a literal and figurative bridge between Tallinn and Stockholm. The ferry's route quickly gained popularity. Tourists, workers, students, and shoppers filled the cabins daily. The voyage typically lasted around 14 hours, a peaceful overnight glide across the sea. While the ship had undergone several refurbishments, some critics noted design limitations. Its bow visor, essential for vehicle loading, had vulnerabilities. These would later become critical. But at the time, the ship's reputation was largely unblemished. Inside, the Estonia was comfortable, even elegant by ferry standards. It had a buffet, saunas, lounges, and a small nightclub. Musicians performed, duty-free shops sold perfumes, chocolates, and spirits. Most cabins were modest, with bunk beds and thin curtains. But the overall experience was more cruise than commute, especially for passengers from newly independent Estonia, where Western comforts were still a novelty. September 27, 1994 began no differently. Passengers boarded in Tallinn with backpacks, suitcases, guitars, and shopping bags. The sky was darkening, but there was no cause for alarm. Weather reports mentioned strong winds, but nothing alarming for a vessel of the Estonia's size. Captain Arvo Andresson and his Swedish first officer, Uno Lorma, were experienced. The ship departed Tallinn harbor at 7:15 p.m. Baltic time. Among the passengers were teenagers returning from vacation, business people heading to meetings, and families enjoying a last-minute getaway. Some Estonian citizens were making their first-ever trip westward. They took photos on deck as the lights of Tallinn faded into the mist. What they couldn't see was the coming front, an autumn storm gathering strength to the west. At around 8:00 p.m., the ship began experiencing stronger winds and choppier waves. By 10:00 p.m., waves reached 4 meters, then 6. Still, nothing unusual was reported. The Estonia continued at cruising speed. Around midnight, passengers began retiring. Some attended a musical performance in the lounge. Others stayed up late talking, drinking, or watching the whitecaps through cabin windows. But what no one realized was that the ship's bow visor, the massive hinged ramp covering the car deck, was under extreme stress. The design, while common, had a known flaw. In heavy seas, repeated wave impacts could weaken the locking mechanisms. At the time, few ships had been fitted with advanced sensors to detect such failures in real time. Around 1:00 a.m., crew members heard loud, rhythmic, metallic bangs from the bow area. This was not unusual in rough weather, but these were louder than normal. According to later reports, the visor's locking devices were beginning to give way. The ramp behind it, which sealed the car deck from the sea, was suddenly exposed. When the visor finally tore away, some say catapulted forward into the sea. The ramp was next. Water gushed into the car deck, a space that spanned the full width of the ship. It was catastrophic. Within minutes, the car deck began to flood. Vehicles shifted violently. The ship's list began. First 15 degrees, then 30, then more. This happened so fast that crew had no time to alert passengers formally. The public address system, in fact, never broadcast a warning. Only a faint Mayday call was recorded. The Estonia, once a ship of national pride and gentle journeys, was now in freefall, helpless and invisible in the storm. And what had begun as just another overnight ferry crossing was spiraling into one of the worst disasters in maritime history. By 1:20 a.m., the Baltic Sea had claimed nearly everything. What remained were fragments, floating cushions, torn clothing, overturned life rafts, and the screams of survivors lost in the wind. The Estonia had vanished beneath the waves just 35 minutes after her first serious list. For those on board, there had been no time to make sense of the chaos, let alone escape it. The night of September 28, 1994, would come to be defined by silence. First, the eerie calm that follows a catastrophe, then the dreadful quiet that haunts a search for life already lost. Rescue helicopters were dispatched from Sweden and Finland, but the sheer speed of the sinking had outpaced any meaningful response. The storm, with its gale-force winds and towering swells, delayed the arrival of help by precious minutes. For the 137 people who survived, every second had been a decision between life and death. Take Marek, a 20-year-old Estonian student who was jolted from his bunk as the ship tilted. He crawled through shifting hallways that had become near vertical shafts, his bare hands bloodied from trying to grip polished metal. Somehow he found an emergency exit and managed to climb onto the open deck. The stars were spinning, he recalled, and the wind was screaming like it wanted to kill us. Many passengers never made it to the upper deck. Some were trapped in their cabins. Others were too disoriented to understand what was happening. A few did make it out, only to find that lifeboats were impossible to release. The ship's list had made them hang at awkward, unreachable angles. Those who managed to grab life jackets often didn't know how to fasten them properly. Some even put them on backward, a tragic error in freezing water. At 1:24 a.m., the Finnish Maritime Administration picked up a fragmented distress call from the Estonia. It was barely intelligible, but clear enough to prompt a full-scale search and rescue operation. The first helicopters arrived around 3:00 a.m., long after the ship had disappeared. They found people scattered across the sea, clinging to debris, silent and barely alive. Many succumbed to hypothermia. The water temperature was around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind chill made survival nearly impossible for more than an hour. Some survivors described being in the water for as long as 4 hours before being rescued. Others were found floating face down, still wearing their life jackets. Only 94 bodies were ever recovered. The horror of the night extended to those who tried to help. One helicopter pilot broke into tears upon seeing a life raft crammed with bodies, some alive, some not. Another rescuer described lifting unconscious passengers from the sea, unsure whether they were saving a life or retrieving a corpse. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed everyone. In the aftermath, questions surged. Why had the ship gone down so quickly? Why were emergency alarms delayed or silent? Survivors insisted they had not heard any official instructions. The ship had 47 life rafts, but only 12 were ever launched. There were supposed to be life jackets in every cabin, but many were locked in closets, impossible to reach in panic. Only one lifeboat was successfully deployed. Even more disturbing was the lack of coordination. It was later revealed that the Estonia's crew had no standard evacuation protocol for a scenario involving a rapid list. They had trained for fires and engine failure, but not for structural collapse. The lack of preparation cost hundreds of lives. In the days that followed, the world watched in stunned disbelief. Images of grieving relatives, flickering candles, and refrigerated trucks filled with the dead-dominated European news. Estonia, a small country still building its post-Soviet identity, was plunged into national mourning. Sweden declared a day of remembrance. Finland followed. International flags flew at half-mast. What sank the Estonia was more than the sea. It was a collision of human error, design flaws, and nature's indifference. And yet, amid the devastation, there were stories of extraordinary human spirit. Crew members who stayed to guide passengers, strangers who pulled one another from the water, survivors who floated together, sharing body heat, repeating each other's names so no one would be forgotten if they didn't make it. That night etched itself into the soul of Northern Europe. It was a storm not just of wind and water, but of grief and guilt. And it left behind a wreck not only on the seafloor, but in the hearts of all who had known the Estonia as something more than a ship. When dawn broke over the Baltic on September 28th, the sea had already swallowed the truth, but a few voices remained, shivering, soaked, and scattered across the choppy water. These survivors became the only witnesses to one of the most rapid maritime catastrophes of the modern era, and what they remembered would form the spine of the unfolding mystery. Their stories were raw and jagged. Some spoke in broken sentences, still in shock, describing a hallway that suddenly tilted like a collapsing tunnel. Others remembered metallic crashes echoing through the hull before the power went out and everything was plunged into darkness. For those who made it to the deck, what they saw was chaos. People slipping, falling, screaming, some in bathrobes, others barefoot on freezing steel. One survivor, a Swedish man named Anders, recalled a woman clinging to the railing, whispering prayers in Estonian. She didn't scream, he said. She just kept saying the same line over and over, like she was already halfway gone. Anders held on to a life raft with 5 others, including a teenager who didn't speak their language, but held hands tightly the entire time. When the sun rose, he was gone, Anders added quietly. Another woman, Kadri from Estonia, had been traveling with her husband and 2 children. Only she survived. She described being tossed into the sea as the ship rolled and seeing the lights underwater as it sank beneath her. It looked like a city going to sleep, she said. The official narrative that followed focused heavily on structural failure. The joint investigation by Estonia, Finland, and Sweden concluded in 1997 that the bow visor had detached, causing the ramp to open and flood the car deck. But many survivors weren't satisfied. They had questions, serious ones. Several survivors reported explosions or loud concussive sounds just before the ship began listing. Some described a moment of sudden lift or jolt, as if something had hit the hull. These accounts were mostly dismissed as confusion under stress, but the human brain records trauma with brutal clarity, and the repetition of similar descriptions cast a long shadow. For many, the emotional aftermath was worse than the physical trauma. Survivors suffered from deep, persistent survivor's guilt. Some withdrew from public life entirely. Others became advocates, determined to investigate what had really happened. Annual gatherings were held, names were read aloud, flowers were cast into the sea. One of the most haunting aspects of the Estonia tragedy is how quickly it disappeared from the daily global conversation. Within a few weeks, media attention shifted elsewhere. But for the people of Estonia, Sweden, and Finland, it never faded. It remained a wound, one tied to national identity, loss, and suspicion. Years later, voices from that night would rise again. A 2020 documentary revealed new underwater footage showing a large, unexplained hole in the ship's hull, on the starboard side, far below the waterline. This revelation renewed public interest and raised troubling questions. Was the hole caused by the impact with the seabed, or did something else happen? Could it support earlier theories about an explosion or collision? The governments of Sweden and Estonia responded by announcing a new joint investigation. It was a rare admission that not all answers had been found. For survivors, it was validation, a sign that their memories hadn't been misfiled as panic or hysteria. Their voices, once dismissed, were now leading a renewed search for truth. But no amount of investigation could change the past. The families of the 852 victims had spent decades grieving in slow motion. Children had grown up without parents. Friends had spent decades visiting empty graves. The sea, they believed, knew everything. But the sea had chosen silence. The stories of those who lived had become memorials in themselves. Some survivors wrote books. Others became speakers or counselors. They didn't just recount what happened. They carried the voices of those who didn't survive. Every year they gathered to mark the anniversary of the disaster. And every year the question remained, what really happened that night? For those who floated in the cold and lived to tell about it, the Estonia will never be a closed chapter. It is a living wound stitched into the fabric of maritime history, one that throbs whenever the sea stirs or another ferry crosses the same path. By the late 1990s, as the Baltic winds returned to their usual rhythm and the ferry routes resumed their crossings, the MS Estonia remained locked beneath the surface, silent and sealed in a watery grave. But the story wasn't finished. In fact, for some, it was just beginning. Amateur divers, journalists, and conspiracy theorists began paying attention to the wreck's exact location. Though technically protected under international law as a maritime gravesite, thanks to the Estonia Agreement signed in 1995 by Finland, Sweden, and Estonia, curiosity did not wane. In 2000, a controversial German documentary team captured footage of the wreck without authorization. What they found startled viewers across Europe, images suggesting a previously unreported hole in the hull. The footage reignited suspicions and fueled long-standing rumors that the Estonia had been carrying sensitive military cargo. Reports emerged that customs officials in Tallinn had allowed uninspected trucks to board the vessel on previous journeys. Could one of these vehicles have contributed to the disaster? Or worse, was the ferry targeted? Official sources downplayed these claims. They pointed back to the original investigation, which had already ruled the cause as structural failure. Yet for many survivors and victims' families, the inconsistencies were too hard to ignore. Why were parts of the investigation sealed? Why had divers been restricted from exploring the entire wreck? Why were sonar scans missing from the public report? Over time, more curious details surfaced. Testimonies from crew members who had expressed concerns about the bow visor's integrity prior to the incident. Experts questioning whether the force of waves alone could have so swiftly sheared off a visor weighing several tons. The debate wasn't just technical, it was emotional. People wanted to know not just how the Estonia sank, but whether it could have been prevented. In nearly 3 decades after the disaster, new research vessels returned to the site with modern imaging technology. This time, with the cooperation of Sweden and Estonia, high-resolution scans revealed a gaping hole on the starboard side of the hull, about 4 meters in diameter. It was near the base of the ship, in a location unlikely to have been caused by natural descent to the seabed. This finding complicated everything. Immediately, maritime engineers and historians began reviewing theories once considered fringe. Could the hull have been damaged before or during the sinking? Could an internal explosion have contributed to the rapid list? Was the visor failure merely one element in a chain of events? No definitive answers were given, but what became clear was that the tragedy was not fully understood. What had once seemed a closed case was now reopened, not in the courts but in the minds of the public. Even government officials admitted that earlier conclusions might need revision. More investigations were promised, and more voices called for full transparency. But history had already taken root. While the wreck itself remains a no-go zone, due to its designation as a protected maritime grave, digital tools have made it possible to explore the site virtually. Several organizations have developed VR models of the ship, created from sonar data and underwater footage. These allow researchers, students, and the public to witness the scale of the disaster in chilling detail. The hull lies on its starboard side, partially embedded in the seabed, its structures twisted and rusted, but still identifiable. The broken ramp, the torn visor, the scattered debris, each piece tells a fragment of a story still unfolding. Even untouched, the wreck continues to speak, not through answers, but through questions that refuse to fade. Today, the site is one of the most solemn maritime locations in the world. No flowers can be left there, no candles lit, but its digital memory, its presence in documentaries, articles, and whispered conversation remains powerful. It is a ship not just lost to time, but caught in a tangle of memory, mystery, and mourning. And so, the Estonia remains more than a wreck. It is a portal into the fragile balance between human ambition and natural force. It is a cautionary tale, a political question, and a human tragedy all at once. It is also one of the most important unresolved stories in maritime history. Though many would never see it with their own eyes, the resting place of the MS Estonia became a sacred coordinate, 57 degrees 23 N, 21°41 in E, etched into charts and remembered with reverence. Located roughly 40 kilometers south of the Finnish island of Uto, the wreck lies on the seafloor in international waters, but is spiritually owned by every family that lost someone aboard. Because of the sheer human loss, and out of deep respect for the dead, the site was quickly designated a maritime grave. In '95, Sweden, Finland, and Estonia signed the Estonia Agreement, prohibiting diving to the wreck and criminalizing any unauthorized attempts to approach it. The intention was clear: let the dead rest in peace. And for many, this sanctity was non-negotiable. Yet even as legal protections remained firm, public interest in the wreck only grew. People wanted to see the ship, to understand how it tilted, where it cracked, how it sank so quickly. And while physical access remained off limits, the digital age found a loophole. In recent years, immersive virtual experiences have made it possible to visit the Estonia without disturbing its grave. Several VR exhibitions, some developed by maritime museums, others by independent documentarians, offer deeply moving simulations of the wreck. Users can explore the twisted corridors, view the broken bow, and observe the car deck where tragedy began. One Swedish exhibit overlays survivor testimonies with 3D renderings, making the experience as much about memory as metal. There is also a full-scale model of the Estonia in Tallinn, housed in the Estonian Maritime Museum. Here, visitors can walk along replica decks, view personal items recovered from survivors, and learn about the lives of those lost. The museum doesn't sensationalize. It mourns with dignity, but also educates. For those who prefer something quieter, the memorial site in Stockholm offers a place to pause. Hundreds of names are etched into polished black stone, curving like a ship's hull. Nearby, flowers and candles are placed daily. Another memorial stands in Tallinn, facing west toward where the ship went down. The names there too are endless, but the silence between them speaks louder. Although no tourists can dive to the site, underwater footage captured during official investigations is occasionally displayed during remembrance events. These grainy, haunting clips show ghostly corridors filled with silt, collapsed cabins, and the sea reclaiming what humans once built. The ship no longer screams, it sighs through rust and shadow. In Twin, on the 27th anniversary of the disaster, a small group of survivors and relatives of the deceased were granted special access to visit the area by boat. They released wreaths into the sea. Some wept, others said nothing, letting the silence speak for them. A priest whispered a prayer in Estonian. A child who had lost both parents stood by the rail, watching the waves, now calm. Though the Estonia can't be visited in the usual tourist sense, its presence is still deeply felt in the maritime world. It is referenced in maritime law classes, discussed in engineering forums, and shown in safety videos aboard modern ferries. Several new protocols were introduced worldwide as a direct result of the disaster, including better visor lock systems, improved crew training, and more reliable public address procedures. If you ask a ferry captain sailing the Baltic today, many will tell you they think of the Estonia every time they pass near its coordinates. It's not superstition, it's respect. And it's a reminder that no vessel, no matter how modern, is immune to failure when human oversight and nature collide. The legacy of the Estonia lives not just in policies or steel, but in the quiet corners of maritime memory. Every rescue drill, every watertight door check, every bolt on a bow visor bears the shadow of that night. Its story continues to ripple outward, invisible to the eye, but deeply embedded in the culture of the sea. Because in the world of ships, some names never fade. The story of the MS Estonia does not end at the seabed. It continues to reverberate through laws, through families, through the vessels that now cross the Baltic with silent acknowledgments. Its wreck lies still, but its wake ripples far into the world of maritime history. In the immediate aftermath, investigators focused on physical causes, steel fractures, wave patterns, locking mechanisms. But over time, it became clear that the disaster had shaken more than technical confidence. It had pierced the public's sense of safety. Questions emerged not just about engineering, but about accountability, transparency, and the weight of responsibility that comes with carrying human lives across the sea. The Estonia's sinking changed how the world approached ferry safety. Ship design regulations were tightened, especially around bow visors and car deck drainage. Emergency lighting systems were upgraded. Life jacket placement became standardized. Crew training was revised to include sudden listing events, and international cooperation in rescue operations improved dramatically. These reforms didn't arise in sterile conference rooms. They were forged in the cold, panicked minutes when passengers fumbled for exits and calls for help were swallowed by wind. These changes are part of the Estonia's legacy, though few outside the industry know just how much the disaster reshaped maritime history. Every time a ship sails with improved evacuation protocols or reinforced structural doors, it does so in silent homage to the 852 who didn't make it. Each maritime museum, each Coast Guard drill, each checklist on the bridge was touched by the ghost of that ferry, lost not just to water, but to all the futures its passengers might have lived. But perhaps the deepest impact lies not in policy, but in memory. For Estonia, a young nation at the time, the loss struck at the heart of national identity. It wasn't just a ship, it was their ship, their people. Nearly every Estonian family was affected, and the tragedy became a shared scar across generations. In Sweden, where most of the victims hailed from, the event remains one of the most painful in modern peacetime. And Finland, bound by shared waters and shared mourning, stood just as still in collective grief. Maritime history is often written in pages of exploration, trade, conquest, but the Estonia inserted a darker chapter, one that reminds us of vulnerability, of how quickly normal can become nightmare. The wreck rests silently now, its cabins flooded with silt and cold memory, but it is not forgotten. Scholars still study it, survivors still revisit it, divers still whisper about it. The sea may have taken its voice, but it echoes in every conversation about safety and truth. The questions, of course, have not all been answered. The newly discovered hole in the hull, the rumors of secret cargo, the delayed alarm, all remain unresolved for many. And maybe they always will. Maritime history is not always about certainty. Sometimes it is about learning to live with the unanswered and allowing remembrance to stand where closure cannot. But even in the face of these mysteries, the story gives us something more: unity. In remembering the Estonia, people from different countries, backgrounds, and beliefs come together. Not in anger, but in tribute. The memorials in Tallinn and Stockholm don't carry blame. They carry names, they invite silence. Reflection, humanity. Today, as modern ships glide across the same waters, their captains hold quiet knowledge of what lies beneath. Not just wreckage, but history. Not just tragedy, but legacy. The Estonia is a name carved deep into maritime history, etched in rust, in reform, in the rituals of remembrance. Its story is not one of defeat, but of meaning reclaimed from disaster. The ship went down, yes, but in doing so, it surfaced truths that no longer sleep beneath the waves. The Baltic Sea lies quiet now. The waves move gently over the grave of a ship once filled with light, laughter, and lives in motion. Time has softened the raw edges of grief, but it has not erased the story. Nor should it. In this silence, the MS Estonia endures, not as a forgotten tragedy, but as a fixed point in maritime history. Its name is spoken in classrooms, remembered in regulations, whispered in shipyards. It has become part of the language of the sea, where every guideline and every emergency drill carries a trace of its legacy. To learn from loss is an act of respect. To remember it with care with a form of tribute. And in the cold stillness beneath those northern waves, the Estonia continues to remind us, no journey is too familiar to turn dangerous, and no ship is too modern to become myth. Thank you for listening.